Hello and welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm clinical psychologist Dr. Steve Thayer, and today on the podcast, my co-host Dr. Reid Robison and I talk about anger. Anger is a difficult emotion for many of us to navigate, including myself, which you will discover by listening to today's episode. Reid and I try to normalize anger for you. We discuss the difference between adaptive and maladaptive expressions of anger. We talk about the different categories of emotion generally and about anger specifically. Try to give you some tips on how to develop a healthy relationship to anger and a lot more. We know that there are a lot of things out there competing for your attention, so thank you. Thank you for shaving off a portion of your valuable attention for us today. We try to make these episodes informative, entertaining, and useful. So if you have feedback to that end for us, please email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca. Reid and I are not on social media very often, but if you'd like to follow us, we are on Instagram. I am at Dr. Steve Thayer, and Reid is at Innerspace Doctor. Reid has way more followers than I do, and it makes me angry. So, in the spirit of today's episode on anger, please follow me on Instagram. If you're willing, please give us a review or a like or a subscribe, depending on the platform you're on. That sends a message to the algorithmic overlords to boost our signal so that we can get in front of as many people as possible. So, without further ado, here is today's episode on anger. Reid, let me tell you a story about anger.
No awkward intro?
No, this is my effort at limiting. Well, I don't know. Awkward intros they could become our trademark.
Signature move. Let's just go to the story.
We could sit in awkward silence for a minute if you want. Namaste. Okay, here's the story.
Here we go.
So, like many human beings, I have a sorted past with respect to the emotion anger. That's what we're going to talk about today, by the way, anger. And here's an example from my life. Brace yourselves, listeners, for a vulnerable story from Steve Thayer's life. So my children struggle with really significant nut allergies, and we've treated it through oral immunotherapy, where you give them small doses of the nut they're allergic to, and over time you increase those doses, and they develop some resistance. So now, a walnut cookie won't kill my son. It'll just make him uncomfortable. So, but in order to maintain that immunity, they have to eat nuts every morning, the nuts they're allergic to. We call it their dose. They have to do their dose every morning. So, I've been trying to get up early and work out, and it's a struggle, but the other day I did it. I got up at 6. I'm in my garage, my little man gym.
Nice work.
And I've got my my trap bar loaded up with some weight, and I'm going to do hard stuff. I'm going to do deadlifts, and, I'm tired. I'm a little jittery too, because I've got a lot of caffeine on board to compensate for not sleeping well enough. So I'm like, okay, I did it. And then right as I'm about to do my first rep, the garage door opens, and there's my 11-year-old. And he's like, Dad, we're out of peanuts. I need peanuts for my dose. And I was overcome with rage, just so angry. And I was a little taken aback by my rage. And my poor son, he can tell because I'm bald and very Caucasian. And so my head lights up like Rudolph's nose. I just get real red, And he, he's quiet and he's sort of just watching. And I'm like, why didn't you tell me yesterday? And it's like, it's not his job to do the grocery store order at the Thayer household. It's not, he's not our in charge of the stock.
Peanut inventory.
Yeah, he's not in charge of peanut inventory. And he just sort of was like, well, I don't know, sort of mumbles. And I said, fine, I'll go to the store. I'll go to freaking Walmart. And I'm just really uncharitable, right? So I get in the car and I'm driving to Walmart at 6 a.m. and the rage is still kind of bubbling, but now it's mixing with something else. Now it's mixing with shame, because you should not have reacted that way. He didn't deserve that from you. And then it's like, frustration. I wanted to work out this morning, and I'm just sort of in this stew of emotion, and I'm gripping the steering wheel of my 2013 paid for Honda Civic and just scream. I just let out this it was the F word. I screamed the F word.
Don't say that, or we're going to lose followers that are related to you.
That's right. At least one listener, she knows who she is, will stop listening. So I just screamed the F word, like super loud. And
Good job.
So loud that, well, this is, I think it, we're going to talk about healthy expressions of anger. We're going to talk about different types of anger. This is one way that I have sort of decompressed anger in my life when it feels like, especially if I've been shoving it down, is in private, typically in my car, yelling really loudly. And so I scream the F word and then I'm like, whoa, it's like I poured cold water in my face with this scream. Like
You felt better.
I felt better. Yeah. I mean, my throat didn't feel great, but I felt a little bit better. So I make it to Walmart and I get the nuts and I come back and
throw them.
I just like, here are your goddamn nuts. Like, no, I came in, I was like, guys, I'm sorry. I reacted the way that I did. And my sons are like, this is a common pattern in the Thayer household. I remember one time, related story, I raised my voice at one of my kids. This was years ago. And I don't want to give the impression I yell a lot. I actually don't. I'm a pretty chill dad. But
I haven't heard you yell.
But yeah, every once in a while, I'm not perfect. So I had done that, and the kids were in bed. And as is customary, when I make a parenting mistake, I'm on my way upstairs to their bedroom to apologize. And before I get to the door, I hear my sons who are sharing a room talking. Oh. and one of them goes, "Don't worry about it. Like, don't worry. Dad's going to come up and apologize anyway." And my heart like melted. I was like, okay, they recognize that I am just human, and they know, they can trust that even though if I get angry at them and I'm scary or whatever, that I'm going to come up and I'm going to repair. I'm going to try to repair the relationship.
It's a great thing to model.
Yeah.
Isn't that beautiful that you can feel the rage, let it move through you, not throw the peanuts at anyone.
Right.
And then have a good, vulnerable human conversation about it and apologize and show your kids that you're human too.
Right. Yeah. So feeling emotions is obviously, I hope it's obvious to everybody, is a feature of being a human. And we wanted to talk specifically about anger today, because I think anger is one of those emotions that we don't typically understand really well as sort of your just regular everyday human, or deal with very well.
Yeah, anger is feared, avoided, and has a lot of healing power in it.
Yeah.
And is very protective too. Like it's there for it evolved for a very good reason.
So why don't we start there then, Reid? Emotions are there for a reason.
Yeah.
Anger included. So anger is in us, and you can think of it in a lot of different ways, but one of those ways is that it's a messenger, like all other emotions. It's there to communicate something to you.
Yeah.
Like fear, for example, is usually there to communicate the presence of a threat. And without fear, you wouldn't perceive that threat and you might be harmed. So it's adaptive in that way. It's like, oh my gosh, there's the bear, run away. So what do you think the adaptive function of anger is? What is the message that anger is trying to communicate to us?
To protect, right? To hold your boundaries, protect yourself or your tribe.
Right.
And the problem lies in the fact that in our culture, far too often, it's avoided, suppressed, interrupted, not felt, and then, well, as our friend and mentor and author we admire so much, Gabor Mate, says in his, what was the book? The Body Says No. Talks about how when these emotions are feared or avoided, the body's going to store them somewhere, like in the form of tightness, disease, walls going up, things like that.
It doesn't disappear, does it? It doesn't dissolve.
Yeah, because emotions are there for a reason. They're evolutionary, adaptive signals that give us information of how to navigate life in a good way. And when you tune them out, you don't have that control panel, those messengers, like you called them, telling you, like, stay away from that cliff. Fight that bear, run. You need comfort. You need space, things like that.
Right. Yeah, and I think with anger in particular, it's, as you said, it's a signal that your boundaries might be being violated or are in danger of being violated and you need to stand up for yourself, or it's some kind of injustice has been done and maybe you want to rectify that.
Yeah.
And you see this sort of epidemic of niceness, and when I say niceness, I don't mean like people being kind and charitable. I mean being super polite, overly
People
polite.
pleasing,
Yeah.
not speaking one's truth, things like that.
And it results in a sort of self-denial. One thing I've said about people who are chronically nice is that they don't know who they are, typically, because anger helps you assert who you are in your world. If somebody's saying, I need you and want you to be this way or do this, and it doesn't jive with who you are, what your goals are, what your values are, anger can help you step into your power, to use a trendy phrase, and draw the boundaries. Like, no. It helps you say no. And if you don't do that, like you were referring to earlier, if you say yes when you should say no, where does that go? It goes down inside. And it can manifest as stomach pain, or it can manifest in other ways like passive aggression.
Depression.
Yeah.
Feel some mix of undifferentiated emotions keeping us stuck and confused.
Right.
Yeah. Another thing you mentioned I think is worth pointing out, just because it's part of this useful emotion primer that I think we can't get enough of because they're so important, is when you said you turned red and your body shows what emotion you're feeling to you, maybe even to others. But that's another thing I like to remember about emotions, is they are signals that give us information of how to navigate life, and they also have a bodily felt sense that's unique to individuals, but often common themes like that flushing, blood pumping, ready to stand one's ground in anger, for example. And then there's an action tendency. There's a vector of direction with it. Like anger as an emotion brings up a very different physiologic response than sadness or grief, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of this emotion heat map that Huberman posted on his Instagram. It's not his. I've seen it.
I like that graphic, that paper a lot.
Yeah, and it's not a heat map in the sense that they were actually doing, infrared scans on these people. This is where people report feeling the manifestations, that bodily felt sense of certain emotions. And I remember anger is like this hotness in the head and in the hands, the upper extremities. Yeah, and that's exactly where I tend to feel it. And a lot of times, people will feel the physical sensations before they feel the emotion, before they're even aware of the presence of the emotions. Like I just know that I've got butterflies in my stomach, or I know that my face is getting hot. But if you ask me how do I feel, I might not be able to tell you.
Yeah, so they have this bodily felt sense that we can recognize. There's an action tendency, and there's usually an underlying need.
There you go.
Like you're sad, you might need comfort. You're angry, you might need to speak it, feel it, stand your ground, move through it.
That's part of the message, I think, is the need. Like emotions are communicating a need. And if we believe that, if we can accept that premise, then it follows that denying those emotions or not allowing them to be expressed in an adaptive way is denying your needs.
Yeah.
It's at the very least not meeting an important need.
Which is like kind of a funny thing to do to ourselves, and we all do it so much, is we have these evolutionary cool things that evolved to give us rapid information, and yet our culture, we've been taught that, especially in gender norms and stereotypes, like women especially have been told, like, don't display anger, or men, traditionally at least, don't display sadness. Right. But if you don't display that sadness, how will people know you're sad and you need comfort? Or how will you tune in and feel that and act on the need, the wisdom that's coming from within you?
Right. Yeah, so that answers the question, why do we, as modern humans, not just by default manage our emotions and metabolize our emotions and listen to our emotions in really healthy ways? It's partly because of our conditioning. And that conditioning comes from our cultural environment. It comes certainly from our early childhood environment, relationships to primary caregivers like our parents, or to siblings, or to teachers, peers. They teach us, for good or for ill, sometimes for ill, what you ought to do with those emotions, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it makes me think of the generations before us and how it was for them. Like for my parents growing up, my grandparents, like my grandfather who fought in World War II, like when you were sent to the war, you were conditioned, trained not to display emotions. Like he had to sit in a foxhole for like months on end. Like I was just learning about this in recent months of why he never wanted to go camping, things like that. It's because like it was just too triggering of this traumatic war zone experience, but where you were almost trained to not display emotions, understandably, and then you bring that home from war as like, oh, we don't show sadness, or like squash that emotion, this sadness, interrupt it, or you fall off your bike, boys don't cry, here's an ice cream, something like that.
Yeah, and so as we were talking about before, the emotion doesn't go away just because you repress it. It trickles into other places, and then we have these sort of unspoken but all agreed upon avenues for, in this example, for men to deal with their emotions. So you got guys who will go to the bar and drink, or guys who will they're philanderers, or they'll do risky things, or guys will be more violent, things like that. Or the woman who, again, these are stereotypes, they're based on generalities, who isn't allowed, quote unquote, or it's not permitted for her to express her anger. What does she do instead? She will cry, but again, the anger doesn't disappear. It still goes internally. So this might be a good time to discuss the difference between primary and secondary and instrumental emotions. So these are emotion categories that I learned from, Leslie Greenberg, one of the kind of co-developer of emotion-focused therapy.
Yeah, I love that man.
Yeah, this is a kind of therapeutic approach that Reid and I both love and use in our practice all the time. So he and others, right? It's not like it was all his, but he and others developed this way of categorizing emotion. You have primary emotions. These are the emotions that show up, like we were talking about before, as those messengers, that you have an unmet need that needs to be met, or and they're the ones that show up first.
Your core emotions. Another way to put it, right?
Exactly. And there's primary adaptive emotions, and then primary maladaptive emotions.
And maybe we can define that, like adaptive, health-based, supporting one's survival. Maladaptive, not so productive for optimal outcomes in your life.
Right. Yeah. So like you could say maybe primary maladaptive anger would be a rage that shows up maybe appropriately, like let's say your boundaries are being violated, but it's so intense and the action tendency that it prompts is physical violence. And let's say it's a context in which physical violence is not adaptive, right? Let's say, you're not at war, or you're not in a UFC fight or something. So that would be it's primary, right? But it's still maladaptive. So that is to distinguish them between secondary emotions. And these are emotions that show up in response to primary emotions that we typically either don't find acceptable because of the conditioning we've talked about earlier, or they're just too hard for us to handle. We don't know how to handle them.
Yeah, let's look, maybe an example might help. Like say you're a male growing up in a time where emotions are not safely felt in one's home, or sadness, let's say, isn't allowed, but maybe anger is a little more acceptable in your environment. You might superimpose the anger on that sadness instead of displaying sadness.
Right.
Other examples?
Well, so the example I started the podcast with, the anger that showed up when my son said, we need more peanuts. I don't think that the anger was a primary emotion. I think it was a secondary emotion to sort of some guilt I have about not being on top of more things at home.
Yeah.
And then frustration, which isn't the same. is anger,
Yep.
where I had this goal and this goal was being prevented. Like I was being literally the definition of frustration, right? I was frustrated. And so what showed up instead was this rage because I didn't want to deal with like the guilt or the feelings of inadequacy that I felt for, not having good stock of my pantry.
When it's hysterical, it's historical, right?
Trademark, Reid Robison.
Your reaction to the peanuts was big. And that suggests to me that it was coming from something other than just the peanuts.
Yeah.
Like there's an accumulation of perhaps unprocessed emotions and or unhealed wounds or any combination of many things like that bottled up, and your son just pushed that button.
Yeah. So if you have a reaction that seems, upon reflection, to be disproportionate to the stimulus, that's usually a good sign that it's a secondary emotional reaction, that there's some kind of history as you're describing.
Yeah, but the good thing about it, emotions do rise and fall like waves. And your anger was like this anger balloon. And if you had interrupted it and squashed it somewhere, who knows where those things go? I mean, you could watch lots of theories we have.
Sure.
But you let it out in a more adaptive way than could have been. Yeah.
It was certainly an intense way to let it out. Like screaming the F word in your car is intense, but I didn't scream it at my son.
Yeah.
Right? And I didn't.
Good job.
I didn't throw the peanuts at him. Right. There are other adaptive ways to ride that wave of emotion, and we'll talk about them, I think, later in the podcast, like how to metabolize and handle and develop awareness of anger. But one more category of emotions, and that's instrumental emotions. So these are the emotions that show up that are sort of used to elicit a particular response in others. So this might be, I've learned that when I cry, I get sympathy. And I don't know how else to get sympathy because I was never given it as a child. This is an example. This isn't my life. I had plenty of attention as a kid. And so this is an instrumental display of emotion to get something.
Yeah. And we often, these things are outside of our conscious awareness.
Right.
They are kind of born in the bosom of our upbringing and family as we figure out ways to get our needs met. And then all of a sudden we're grown-ups throwing tantrums to get XYZ or attention or get what we want or need in a way that, might be short-term productive towards some goals, but not long-term healthy adaptive or might be interfering with our progress in life in general.
Yeah. So that's kind of emotion categories from an EFT or emotion-focused therapy theoretical perspective. Yeah. There's lots of other ways to think about emotion. That's just a way that I kind of like to have a working idea of emotion function in my head.
This was, I think, not this past holiday season, but the year before, I had bought a bunch of emotion wheels on pillows and given them as Christmas gifts to like family members. And it's fun to see those on a sofa. It's a nice reminder. I'll just pick it up sometimes and be like, okay, it's a reminder to check in with your emotion because we have, as a culture in general, distanced ourselves a little too much, in my opinion, from these signals that we have that can guide us. So any reminders, any practice we can do of like, what am I feeling? What do I need? I think is very productive work.
Certainly, especially in a time in human existence where like not only are we sort of disconnected from emotions, I think we actively avoid anything other than
the
peace.
Good ones?
Yeah, peace, contentment, joy, pleasure, happiness, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's the irony or the paradox of the bad emotions, feelings. And of course, we don't categorize them as bad. We're talking about them being quite useful. But who wants to, on purpose, feel the negative, difficult emotions? But the irony is that you need to get to the other side of that. Like, I'll give an example that ties a couple of these things in, or an analogy, I guess. When I was, don't know, early 20s. I was going on a road trip. I was newly married, going on a road trip to Lake Powell in a used car with lots of miles, 6 figures on the odometer, and the check engine light came on. I'd never took auto shop, and I kind of ignored it to keep up with the caravan, and we made it okay to Lake Powell, but it's hot down there. This is like on the border of Utah and Arizona in the desert, and had a pretty epic trip. That place is cool.
Yeah, it's awesome.
But then coming up the hill back to Utah County, Salt Lake County, in the summer, the check engine light's on, and I think like a low oil. I don't even remember. But point is, the car overheated, broke down, cracked the engine, and died. We left it in like Page, Arizona, for maybe we got a few $100 for this several $1,000 car to leave it with the mechanic because it was just like beyond repair.
Yeah.
And what does it have to do with emotions? I forget. No, I'm just kidding. It's like the dashboard that gives us signals is like emotions, and that check engine light could be anger that I'm ignoring or fear that I'm ignoring. And because I ignored it, it got kind of stuffed back in there and self-destructed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a signal to you that something was wrong. And when we ignore those signals, we don't repair what's wrong, then we get wear and tear, and eventually, like your car, can break down.
So I avoided it because it was painful to have to pull over, find a mechanic, call the caravan and say, we're taking a detour. And certainly learned a bigger painful lesson.
So this is a good like example to reflect on from a compassionate lens, self-compassionate lens.
Yeah.
Because you said it was painful. It would have been painful to admit that something's wrong with the car. You got to pause your trip. You got to take it in. You got to pay for it. You got to wait. You got to get a rental. Like, it's a pain in the ass, right? So I don't love pain. I would rather avoid pain. So let's have some compassion for ourselves. If you're listening to this episode and you're reflecting kind of on your own struggles with emotion, in particular anger, and you're like, oh man, I suck at this. We all do, to a certain extent, and for good reason, because it's really hard. It's really scary to face your anger. It can be really frightening to face your fear, right? Kind of goes without saying, but it can be intimidating to let yourself feel sad. So yeah, just a self-compassion moment here.
That's a really good point. So it makes me think, have you ever been to Hawaii, North Shore?
I have, yeah.
Big waves. I was there once when there's surf competitions. These waves were huge. I love to jump in a good wave, whether it's boogie boarding, body surfing, or pretending to try to surf. But I think we've all probably had this experience of you stand in front of a big wave, it hits you, you're going to get your butt kicked, right? You're going to get flattened and tumbled, tossed around. But if you dive in, you can make it through the other side of that. Another emotion analogy that I heard Les Greenberg give once is that our emotions are like those waves, and if you just stand there and refuse to acknowledge or deal with it, eventually it's just going to knock you over. But you can surf it, ride it, dive in, and make it through the other side, because emotions do rise and fall, and they run their course, and it doesn't even take that long in general if you really give yourself the time and space and compassion to feel it.
Yeah, completely. And if you're willing to do that, then you might discover that, hey, this is a secondary emotion. And sometimes you need help, like from a therapist or a knowledgeable friend or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And you'll drill down underneath your anger, and you'll discover that there's, like we were saying before, there's sadness there, or embarrassment there, or disgust, or something like that. And that's the emotion you need to get in touch with and ride that wave.
Yeah, because often underneath the anger is something there, that hasn't been dealt with, or that is very productive to work on, or some deep sadness or unprocessed grief, or just a pile of, like you were saying about the example, a pile of other crap beneath the surface, maybe out of your own awareness.
Right. Anything else about sort of how we define anger or?
Yeah. Two types of anger that I like as a framework. There's healthy, empowered, assertive anger.
Mm-hmm.
Pick any of those
Yeah.
qualifiers. And then there's maladaptive or reactive or toxic, destructive anger. There are two types. And, when that wave begins, I would call your screaming in a car instead of throwing peanuts at someone, a more adaptive way, right? To let it rise and fall or to display it.
And I think I agree. Sometimes it's hard to be charitable to myself, but
yeah,
because it allowed me to then reflect on what was underneath it. I was sort of caught up in it until I let it decompress by screaming.
Yeah.
And then I was able to be honest and be like, okay, what am I really feeling right now? I'm feeling, like I was saying before, like some guilt or frustration. And once I had access to that and gave myself space to feel it, then I could come back to my kids and do like I described before. I could apologize and I had enough time to do a little bit of a workout, and then I could be a little less irrational. Like, hey, I got some of my workout in. Maybe I'll finish it when I get home from work. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah, because there is not much of that you can do while riding the wave of that emotion in the thick of it, right? That's extremely important in couples therapy work.
Yeah.
And day-to-day life in general for all of us is like, there's a lot to be said about the passage of time, even giving it a few minutes to let the emotion rise and fall before we react.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. When I think about how to, you hear a lot about anger management, right? Mm-hmm. This person hit his wife and he was court ordered to go to anger management. I don't love that phrase. I don't love the term anger management.
Yeah.
I prefer, we need to understand or anger processing a little bit better as a way of approaching our emotion. This emotion that can be really scary. When it's maladaptive or destructive, like you were saying, anger can result in some terrible things, right? You can harm people when you have anger on board, especially if you're not listening to it. So yeah, we're not trying to imply all right, everybody, feel all your feelings. They're all, to their fullest extent. And if other people can't handle your feelings, screw them. That's not necessarily what we're trying to imply. But yeah, so how do we, if we're not going to use the term management, and you can, I'm not saying it's terrible, but how do we deal with and metabolize and process and move through anger?
I saw this headline recently. I think it was for a talk. I think it was a TED talk on YouTube. It said handle your emotions before they handle you. And while there's a good point underneath that, the handling is where it needs some definition, needs some finesse and gentleness. So I remember from emotion-focused therapy training and from the work we've done here around our emotion-focused ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, I've kind of taken those principles and found a little easy acronym for me anyway that I call the art of emotion processing. And it's pretty similar to what, say, Les Greenberg might teach. He'll use different letters, but ART. The first one is access and or awareness. So you've got to first do what we were just talking about. It's what am I feeling? Label it, sense into it, kind of sit with that. And then the R would be regulate, or some might call it modulate, or figure out how to feel it in a positive way. And then that last category, the T, would be transform it, which you could do in a number of ways, transform it. Emotions can be transformed by corrective experiences, like your sadness from a comforting hug from a loved one, or maybe even through feeling the unfelt anger that the sadness might be masking as, or in other ways. But those are three concepts that come to mind.
I like that. And incidentally, I think the corrective emotional experience is often one of the really powerful components of psychedelic assisted therapy for things like PTSD. Like MDMA for PTSD allows people to have a corrective emotional experience with their trauma, especially if their trauma involves any kind of self-shame. Like when I was in the Air Force, I worked with a lot of military members who had survivor guilt. They were their buddies got killed and they didn't. All, quote unquote, all they got was like their leg blown off and they got to survive. Or if they didn't sustain any physical injuries, but they witnessed the horrors of war. Like I'm thinking about this one guy I treated whose friends were blown up at the gate by a vehicle-borne IED. And, he had to go and basically pick up the pieces of people he knew. And his person was never physically harmed, but just, racked with survivor's guilt. And MDMA helps, at least we think, right, in the trials that MAPS is doing, people approach these traumas and have a corrective emotional experience with the memories. That you can feel charity for yourself and compassion and love and understanding.
Yeah, that's the whole premise behind MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, for example, I think, is you take this medicine that creates a safe space in and around you, gives you a sense of trust, warmth, comfort towards self, towards others, like your therapist, your therapy team, your partner if you're doing couples work. And then you can go there. You can go back to these emotions because you can't just heal. That's the irony and the tragedy of it all is you can't just think about an old memory and heal it. Like you do have to feel it to heal it. And it's really sad that someone who's gone through a big trauma has to go there again if it is not fully processed. But sad, but the beauty on the other side of that is can be so liberating. And MDMA is just so powerful at that kind of thing where you can have an individual who's being held in a safe, respectful, loving way with proper boundaries, like the safe set and setting and container, and they can like kind of relive that experience in their emotional world, and have it be a corrective experience this time where like they're actually allowed to cry, they're allowed to talk about it, and that's new and that's fresh and that changes things. It lays down new neuron pathways that you realize, wow, I can be safe, I can feel whole, I can like live fully again. Yeah. What you're saying is it's sort of a callback to what we were talking about earlier about emotions and that they are full nervous system phenomenon. Oh yeah.
And I started out my psychology career as sort of a cognitive behavioral therapy therapist, because I'm naturally sort of a cerebral thought kind of guy. And at this point in my career, I am convinced that the best way to heal, the most thorough way to heal, is with the entire nervous system, like the whole body. We aren't like meat puppets with the computer in our head, and we're more than that. And so if the problem is in the body, it doesn't make sense to just address it in the mind, because the mind and the body aren't separate anyway.
Yeah, good luck.
Yeah. And I'm not like saying that as a huge criticism against CBT. I think it's a great therapeutic approach.
It has its uses for sure, and happens to be gold standard intervention for a number of different conditions that need that. Effective. But other conditions like trauma, as an example, really does in many situations, many need a bottom-up approach, a body-based somatic approach to healing. It's kind of like the difference between talking about a relationship or a feeling, like saying, oh yeah, I love my partner, my spouse, versus actually turning to them or even turning to a chair that has in your mind's eye them sitting in it, in say chair work and therapy, and saying, I love you. Like that's an embodying expression that brings up the emotional experience that we can work with in the here and now.
Oh yeah. I can't tell you how many traumatized vets I've worked with that could tell me in gory detail about their traumatic experiences with a straight face. You know, the emotion isn't registering at all because they're disconnected from it. And how do a lot of these folks disconnect? They drink a lot of alcohol. They do a lot of benzos, right? Mm-hmm. They're numbing the body so they don't have to feel the bodily felt sense of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
So I like ART. I like that acronym.
Yeah. Well, what else would you add in terms of anger and emotion processing?
There you go. So I have also a 3-letter acronym it's basically the same thing. It's just the 3 A's of anger processing. So awareness, like you were talking about, developing awareness of the bodily felt sense, awareness of, is this primary or secondary? Like, get curious about your anger. You got to get to know your anger. A lot of times we just feel it, but get a sense for it. Spend some time with it. And then the second A is accept. So that's this is a feeling that is okay to feel. Like we were talking about before, it's a messenger. There's nothing inherently wrong about any emotion. So this is a mindfulness approach, a non-self-judgment approach to the presence of the anger. It is okay for me to feel it. So we've got awareness, accept, and then the third is address, and that might be transform in the ART acronym. Let's address the anger. So addressing the anger might be, I need to scream the F word in my car.
Yeah.
Or it might be, I need to breathe and not say anything right now. Because I know if I say something right now with the level that my anger is at, I might say something I regret. Yeah. I might harm somebody.
I need to count to 100 or something.
So in the context of a partnership, whether it's a romantic partnership or a business partnership, you might say, hey, I need some time to cool off before we continue this conversation. And that would be a good way to address your anger in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
So aware, accept, and address.
That brings to mind another strategy, I think, for helping, especially for helping others work through anger. And that we can also request as individuals with an intense emotional experience when we need help is validation. Like validation, like takes the hot anger out of the anger balloon and helps it kind of rise and fall. And by validate, I mean, instead of what our society might have taught us or conditioned us of like, don't show anger. Like that's not appropriate, not okay. Shut up. Don't feel it. That emotional self-interruption. Instead of that, it's, we can, instead of denying or instead of jumping in trying to fix, we can just say, wow, like I can understand that would be so incredibly frustrating because, and then our dear friend and colleague Adele LaFrance has some amazing scripts in her emotion-focused family therapy modality that help with that. And I remember her saying once in one of her workshops, you got to move from the but to because.
Yeah.
So it's not like, I know you're angry, but it wasn't my fault. Like, but right. Come on, like, instead of that invalidating response that is so common, it's because, like, I would be pissed too because, like, that's not okay because this is heavy, because this hurts. And that just helps the anger move in such a productive way.
Well, and in her scripts, she insists on at least 3 becauses, right? Like you really want to pour on the validation.
Yep.
Reid, if I could teach one skill, if I only was allowed to teach one skill to the human race, it would be validation.
Yeah.
It would be how to validate others and how to validate yourself. It is so powerful. It's powerful as a parent for your kids. It's powerful as a partner to any other adult. It's powerful for yourself. It's the antidote to shame. It is so important.
Yeah, it's at the heart of it's a practical tool to applying empathy and compassion. So how do you validate yourself?
I mean, much in the same way that you validate other people. It's just harder to believe when it's coming from myself. But I think about all the work that's been done. Is it Kristen Neff? On
self-compassion. Yeah, she's amazing.
Common humanity is one of those 3 pillars, I think, or chair legs to self-compassion. And that's the one I really like. Mm-hmm. It's, all of us are screwed up. I was having a conversation with my friend the other day about this. Like, hey man, nobody is as impressive as they appear.
And everyone's amazingly impressive and a hot mess.
Exactly. Exactly. So I love that common humanity concept that we are all just walking each other home, like Ram Dass would say. And we're all in this together. And that just makes me, as a person who has a tendency to compare himself to others, that helps me self-validate, remembering that. Yeah.
So we can become like the vessel for someone's anger in a way, or we can create that safe container for them to feel it. And it is amazing. I agree with you on that. Skill goes so far in interpersonal interactions, which is a large part of being human.
Yeah. Well, folks, it's one of the reasons why Reid and I have a job. Because for most people, we don't get the kind of validation we need and deserve in our day-to-day life. So you come to a therapist who's professionally trained and maybe called to the work because they're naturally good at validating you.
Yeah.
So you sit on their couch and they listen to you and they don't judge you and they don't say but, they say because. And it feels so good. It feels so good to be witnessed and seen by somebody without judgment, with all your messiness, and be told, this is understandable.
And you might not even know what they're doing that feels good, but some of those basic concepts of mirroring someone's emotional experience and the level of it, if they're on level 8 of this anger skyscraper, you might need to get up to floor 8 and ride down with them a few notches gradually, mirroring and co-regulating back to solid ground. There are some basic skills that that you learn in the psychotherapy world that can go a long way, applied in day-to-day life too.
Yeah, it helped me out a ton as a young parent. Like when my kids were first sort of coming into their own and expressing their emotions, learning to, I think John Gottman's book, How to Raise an Emotionally Intelligent Child, was one that I read early, thankfully, in my career as a parent. And that really helped because, man, it made all the difference. When one of my children was having a temper tantrum or whatever, if I just said, "You're really angry, huh?" And that serves to help them learn emotion literacy too, right? Well, I guess what I'm feeling is anger. Yeah, because your brother took your toy and that doesn't feel fair. Or like you were mentioned, mirroring. Sometimes you can go even a little bit higher and see what they'll do. Like, you just want to rip his head off. Whoa, no, I don't want to go that far. Helps them kind of understand what level their own emotions are at. Yeah,
and if you don't meet it, you might be accidentally invalidating. Like if someone says I was full of terror and I wanted to rip their head off, and you say, sounds like you were a little bit irritated. Right. You might have just...
missed the mark.
Yeah, you might have just pushed a whole nother button. Yeah, so there is that mirroring co-regulation piece that can go a long way. And the co-regulation, even the subtleties of the rhythm of breathing or, just the body language and things like that can... we have mirror neurons. Look at us as humans. We respond to all this information in real time in a really impressive way that we're not even aware of.
Yeah, I'm thinking again about your question, how to self-validate. And sometimes I'll tell my clients to do this if it works for them, to talk to yourself out loud.
Yeah.
Another form of therapy that you and I really like is internal family systems, IFS. And The premise being that you are composed of many parts, many selves, and they serve functions, and sometimes it gets complicated, but sometimes the way that they serve, the roles that they're in, are a little self-defeating, sometimes a lot self-defeating. And if you can approach those parts from what Dick Schwartz calls the sort of the capital S self, and heal or witness or validate what those parts are feeling, then they tend to relax.
Yeah.
So sometimes I'll even talk out loud to my parts, like, "Wow, Steve, you are feeling really, really frustrated right now.
You just swore in the car. That was loud.
You said the F word.
Dang, dude."
Your mother would be so disappointed.
Hey, you're venturing into not the validating words.
No, that's my inner critic. So then I would turn to my inner critic and say, "Hang on."
You'd hop in the other seat.
Yeah.
So it reminds me of the process of self-exploration that we have used so much in our emotion-focused ketamine-assisted psychotherapy work and other settings. And, in fact, there's a link to one I've guided, one Adele's guided that we can link to in YouTube. But just a summary of the practice, because I think it's so useful for me personally and for anyone pretty much I've done it with, is you look at something recent that irritated you, that pushed a button, like your story at the beginning.
Yeah.
And then you look at and you start to label, what was that feeling? Like I felt like unheard. I felt like disrespected. You just kind of label the feeling, but then you go back in your memory banks to the earliest time you remember feeling that way. And then you visualize that scene, and you can often see the root of it. It's it's surprisingly easier than you'd think to jump back to one of the early sources of that. And then that's where the reason I bring it up is the self-compassion comes in the sense that to close the loop on that, you can imagine your inner child at that age when that first experience happened and offer comfort, validation, reassurance. You can practice it like you're talking about in the parts work or inner child work. And then it's amazing what that does to the nervous system in the here and now by going to an unmet need that created a deep wound or trauma or repository of shame. And then to get to kind of bring it up in a safe way, feel it, experience it, heal it, let it go is extremely powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the reasons I really like that exercise is because it does a good job of helping you discover that unmet need that a lot of times these patterns around emotions are formed.
Yeah.
You're in reaction to.
Yeah, what did you need at the time that you were feeling like disrespected or unsafe or violated? Like what you need protection, you needed to be seen, heard, loved, understood. And maybe that's something we could just touch on. Because I know we're talking about a lot of different, a lot of parts of a framework of emotions, and anger is like, how do you conceptualize our needs as humans?
Needs. That's a curveball, Reid. That's a pretty deep topic.
Yeah.
How do we conceptualize our needs?
Like my favorite ones that I tend to look to first would be, and there are a lot of different lists. Even Tony Robbins has a list of some that he's come up with. But the ones I like are the need for safety, for comfort, for love, to be seen, understood, celebrated even, one we forget.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Maslow's hierarchy pops into our minds. It's one that's often cited, but sometimes criticized for not being entirely accurate. But usually at the bottom of a need pyramid or a need hierarchy are those fundamental ones you mentioned, like safety,
food, shelter.
Right.
Yeah.
And then maybe, access to a sexual partner so you can procreate from like an evolutionary perspective. Like these are sort of our fundamental biological basic needs.
Yeah, your DNA's needs.
Yeah. But once those are taken care of, then you can move on to these more higher order needs, like needing to be witnessed and celebrated and accepted to be part of the family or the clan or the community or the and then like
to feel like you belong.
Yeah, belonging is a really important one. Mm-hmm. And then there's sort of these even higher order ones that are like the need to self-actualize or individuate from a perspective.
I like that term, the self-actualization, self-realization. Just seems more accessible than enlightenment.
Right.
Enlightenment seems a little bit like the term perfection or like a unattainable holy state. Even though I personally believe that, enlightenment, if we're going to use that term, as humans, we spend some time in there, and we spend a lot of time in this unenlightened, unawake state. And, some people spend more time above that line in this like awake, conscious, enlightened kind of state. But I like the self-actualized, self-realized. It kind of suggests to me that we've gotten to a place where we know we're going to dip down and be unenlightened now and then all the time, but we've hit a place of awareness and personal work and development where we can see that.
Mm-hmm. And I referenced IFS a second ago, like to sort of merge those two concepts together of self-actualization from like a Rogerian or a Maslow hierarchy perspective, and this capital S self perspective. Like all of us by default, according to the theory, have that in us. And the enlightenment process or the self-actualization process is not necessarily a process of building, it's a process of peeling back. The conditioning, peeling back the layers so that you can gain access to what's already there. This self that already knows how to be compassionate because that's its nature. Yeah. And when we're in touch with it more, maybe that's, you could say, is a form of enlightenment. It's being in alignment or with self energy, or it's allowing the capital S self to have the steering wheel of your consciousness more often.
Yeah.
And it's not a destination you reach, right, Reid? It's not like I'm enlightened. At least I don't think it is, right? I think it's more of a balance beam you have to get back on when you inevitably fall off of it.
Yeah, I agree.
If anybody tells you they're enlightened, this is my personal opinion.
I'm an enlightened guru.
I would be skeptical of that person. I don't know if that's just my own religious trauma that I've gone through in my life, but I am highly skeptical of people who are selling themselves as gurus or enlightened folks.
Yeah, you mentioned Ram Dass with when you said the quote, "We're all just walking each other home," and he's one of my favorite examples of someone I'd call an enlightened being, and he would say, he would just have a different way of describing it in a humble way that embraces his humanity, of this. Yeah, he's for example, when Ram Dass was getting old, he had a stroke. And he was this beloved teacher, guru to many, who would go around and just spread good vibes and enlightened wisdom. And then he had a stroke, and he became ornery for a bit. Mm-hmm. When he was in the hospital, he writes in his book, his latest book that came out after his death. It's a beautiful work called Being Ram Dass. He talks about some stories of when he was just mean to people who came in to bring him a plate of food or balloons or something for a moment. And then he got out of that unawakened state and back into that place of being love instead of being suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember learning that because I didn't come across Ram Dass until a year or two ago. Mm-hmm. And my first exposure to him was his post-stroke sort of almost Jesus-like behavior. And I remember being amazed at how he appeared. Like, he's got this stroke, but he's always smiling, and so the more I learned about him, I was really happy. Maybe happy is the wrong word. Relieved. I don't know. To know that he was human. Like, he went through that really, really grumpy phase. Yeah.
Yeah, because you were grumpy the other day when you wanted to work out.
Was. Sure was. Anything else around anger? How about dealing with anger in others? We talked about validation. Sometimes you need to protect yourself from people's anger, folks. Like, use your own anger to stand up for yourself, especially if somebody is being violent or abusive or verbally, physically, or sexually or otherwise. There's a great book on dealing with I think the author calls them chronically irrational emotions in other people. It's called Talking to Crazy by Mark Goulston. And he justifies his use of the word crazy by saying, like, everyone's crazy. Like, we all have crazy in us, but some people have these patterns of chronic irrationality and here are some tips for how to deal with folks like that.
Another thing, or disclaimer, I guess I'll mention, is some people don't display anger. They lost that beautiful ability long ago, and I've fallen into this trap a fair amount through my life too, as just thinking, I'm unflappable, or thinking it's a good thing that I don't display anger, but when in reality, we're all like pressure cookers with all this stuff coming in. We're storing it in the body, and it's spilling out in other ways. If we don't like open up a valve and consciously release it like you did in the car, it's going to show up. It might show up in like a psychosomatic illness or exacerbation of pain, or like mix of undifferentiated negative emotions showing up, like depression, anxiety, so many different things. Like shame is that grows in the dark, is at the core of so many mental health conditions, and
physical health conditions. I mean, heart attack in your 50s and high blood pressure, could be because of these unrealized, unexpressed emotions. Yeah.
So I bring that up to just point out that we all have an emotion processing style, and there are lots of ways to look at it. But I like a simple categorization of like predominantly self-critical or predominantly self-interrupting. And it's not too hard to tease out. Are you always putting yourself down when something happens? Like, I'm so stupid. Or are you, one who just doesn't show emotion? And like, even if you think that's a peaceful, chill way to go through life, emotions add texture to our lives. They not only give information, but there's the beauty of the positive emotions and the other side of the coin of the negative, and you can't have one without the other.
Yeah. So the self-interrupting or self-criticizing way of dealing with anger makes me think of sort of other defense mechanisms that we'll use against fully feeling our feelings. Experiencing our feelings. The one that always comes to mind is the Freudian one, displacement, where your boss makes you angry, but you can't strangle your boss because then you lose your job. So you go home and you kick your dog. You're displacing that emotion from the place where it belongs to something that's more vulnerable and easier to express it to, and that's an unhealthy, Freud would call an immature defense mechanism.
Makes me angry at whoever's going to kick their dog, and makes me want to protect the dog.
Yeah. Exactly.
In an assertive, empowered, adaptive anger way for the survival of those beautiful creatures.
There you go. An excellent example of how to move through anger in a mature way, Reid. Let's wrap it up. Thank you to our dear listeners for listening to Reid and I talk about anger.
Yeah. We should have showed a little more anger. Maybe next time.
Yeah. We'll let's start each episode that we have about an emotion. Let's start by completely expressing the full cornucopia. That's probably the wrong word. The full palette wheel of that emotion. I'm feeling embarrassment for cornucopia.
I was going to ask you how you're feeling.
Yeah. You can tell I'm hot in the face.
Let's zoom in on Steve's face and analyze the situation.
It'd be great for the Instagram.
I know. Thank you for your vulnerability.
You are welcome.
it's really refreshing and helpful for me anyway.
Awesome. Thanks, Reid. Thank you, dear listener, for listening. It means a lot to me. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Novamind, a mental health company that specializes in psychedelic medicine and research. You can learn more about Novamind's mission to increase access to legal, safe, and evidence-based psychedelic medicine at novamind.ca. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're using to listen or watch. Also, if you're feeling generous today, please leave us a glowing review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. If you'd like to reach out to us with questions, suggestions, scathing criticisms, etc., please email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca. Thanks again. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Please consult a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.